Good afternoon and welcome to Points of View. It's here where politics isn't a taboo but a conversation starter. Now, the United States leadership has been faced with many foreign policy decisions over the last decade that have not only affected the lives of American citizens, but also the people of Iraq, Afghanistan, and other Middle Eastern nations. This past week, I had the pleasure of speaking with General Zinni about his personal experience in the military. General Zinni was a member of the United States Marine Corps for the most of his life and has been to over 70 countries where he was immersed in diplomatic and business and academic and public service experiences. With his experiences still fresh in his mind, we spoke about how cultural competency is defining the future of American military intervention. Growing up in a two-parent immigrant household, cultural competency wasn't something that he simply learned on the war front. It was kindled in his home. This next clip spotlights both his upbringing and how his time in the Vietnam War actively shaped his own international viewpoint and perspective.
Well, I think that was part of it. I think obviously since they were immigrants to this country, it was a cultural mix, and so we certainly understood the differences in cultures. But I think what really made me more interested in it was my first tour of duty in Vietnam, because as a young lieutenant I was sent as an advisor to the Vietnamese Marines. And I went to language school, learned to speak the language, and then we wore their uniforms. We operated with them. I rarely saw another American. They had a quartering act, so when we operated in different areas, we lived in the villages with the people, actually in the houses. And I came away from that year with a different perspective. As I reunited with my friends and buddies and classmates that had been with the U.S. units, I really thought I saw the war from an entirely different perspective. I saw it from the culture, from the people. And it left me with a deep impression that that's an aspect of any kind of conflict that you have to take into account to understand. It's not simply a matter of trying to shoot your way to victory, which doesn't work in the kinds of conflicts we've found ourselves in since the end of World War II. And it sort of really, I think, developed my interest in global affairs, different cultures, cultural history, traditions, and how they shape attitudes and belief systems and how people think. And I think that was really the roots of it. Certainly my parents' roots had something to do with it too. So I was exposed to maybe a different kind of culture from the beginning than others might have been.
He also described how the military is expanding its understanding of other cultures as well. General Zinni discussed how military leadership is taking strides to educate soldiers before they go overseas, so that when they do arrive, they already have a cultural sense of knowledge upon their arrival. Take a listen.
I think one of the lessons out of Vietnam was the need to understand cultures, and not only to understand how cultures differ, but how the different elements of a culture, religious belief systems, history, geography, all shape attitudes and the way people respond to different things, and to the way they act and to the way they think. And the military now has invested a lot in that kind of training. Our military education system stresses that. There's more cultural awareness down to even the troop level. Our officers and NCOs are given classes in cultural appreciation, understanding how to dissect cultures, understanding how to interpret what they see and hear through a cultural prism. So that's because of the nature of the kinds of conflicts we find ourselves in now, where they're not purely military, where the military has to blend in with the political, the economic, the social, institution building, capacity building, and understand how you may be more supportive of that rather than they be supportive of you. That in many cases it's helping build capacity in societies that are in unstable situations, that you need to understand the societies and what you're doing. So we still struggle with it, I think, but I think there's at least a sincere appreciation for it and an education system that addresses it.
His commentary prompts a very important question. As our world becomes smaller and smaller, perhaps will it become easier to understand these differences in values and belief systems? General Zinni discussed how globalization, which he defines as an essentially shrinking world by the exchanging of views and abilities, has some pretty interesting results. And following part of the discussion, General Zinni described the effects of globalization on personal identification and nationality. Take a listen.
It's very difficult to think in isolationist terms. We're too interconnected, the information age, and the interdependency on all sorts of things, the network that connects us. This all has made us more aware of what goes on and the need to obviously understand the world from a global perspective. It's probably de-emphasized the role of sovereignty and nationhood in many respects, which can be good or bad. You know, I mean, I think people's identities are stated differently now. They might be less apt to identify themselves purely by nationality. The world has become more aware of its tribal roots. In many ways, they have identities we could never have conceived of before. I think Facebook's the third largest nation in the world, and you know, there may be people that see their Facebook identity as a greater way of identifying themselves than they do maybe from their nationality or ethnic background or religious background.
Globalization does not arrive just through an economic system. It also comes through the cyber world and historical events. Interestingly, General Zinni marks Facebook as a cultural phenomenon that has shaped our individual identities and displays the importance of situational and events within culture. Another is September 11th, 2001. General Zinni discussed his personal shock when the plane hit the World Trade Centers on national television, and when it became personal as some of his fellow soldiers were killed in the attack on the Pentagon. Fast forwarding through the military response, he discussed how foreign policy shifted from Afghanistan to Iraq. Here are his points.
Well, first of all, I thought it's obvious that we needed to go after al-Qaeda, who had done us harm. I didn't understand Iraq, because obviously the attack on 9/11 had nothing to do with Iraq. From my time at Central Command and experience I had there, Saddam Hussein was well contained. He was no threat. I thought the priority should be al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and that this would be, first of all, a distraction and would, I think, cause us not to pay attention as much as we should in Afghanistan to getting al-Qaeda. Turned out to be true since they got away. We tried to do it on the cheap with the Renan Army, with the Northern Alliance, and it didn't work out in our interest. And then, secondly, not having a UN resolution to back us up in Afghanistan as we did in the first Afghan war, I thought was going to limit international participation. Our allies were struggling to understand why we were getting distracted and committed here. And then thirdly, I saw the plans that we had developed for a potential Iraq invasion thrown away. And this sort of naive approach that it was going to be a liberation and flowers in the street and a cakewalk, and we knew better. We knew that inside this country it could come apart very quickly. The ethnic and religious rivalries would come to the top. They had very porous borders that could have bad things come across. And then when I saw the nature of the plan that they accepted, they threw away the overwhelming force we felt we needed to secure the borders, protect the population, and this sort of mad dash to Baghdad and remove the regime, which we never thought was very difficult, could always be done with less than 3 weeks, that they did not take into account the requirement for an occupation, the threats that were inside Iraq, the threats that could come across an open border, and so all those things came back to haunt them. They made some terrible decisions. Our plan called for not disbanding the Iraqi army, to revet its leadership and change it, but to keep it in being. Don't have people in the streets with guns that have nothing to do and no pay. Don't disband the state-owned factories and put people out of work. So almost every terrible decision, from the numbers of troops to the actions, economic actions, to the disbanding of the army, all led, I think, to something no one expected, which was a protracted conflict and an internal disruption that took 10 to 12 years to get right and still isn't right.
General Zinni's convictions led him to write a set of books about the War on Terror. He says that he felt it was his calling and his obligation to speak out with his writing, despite the opposition and personal attacks that he met along the way. This determination is evident as he is currently working on another book. Let's hear about it.
I'm writing a book now on military intervention, our history of it, and more often than not, the interventions don't go well. The decisions made early on are not right. Colin Powell and Caspar Weinberger wrote a set of doctrine on what we should use as a checklist before we go in, ensure you have popular support, ensure the cause is just, ensure that you understand the political objectives, what the end state's going to be, that you make a total commitment to what you're about to do. And almost every one of these things was violated in the way I saw it in our approach to Iraq and Afghanistan. It wasn't that I was opposed to military action necessarily, it's just the way you do it. I have that same concern now about Iran. I mean, everybody is all excited about red lines and attacking, and it may be necessary to use military action. But I hate to hear these thoughts about, well, it's just a military strike or an airstrike or something like that. It's an act of war. And knowing what the Iranian capabilities are, as I do in a very detailed way, we're going to engage in a long, protracted conflict, and people better go in with their eyes open and understanding what it's going to take. And I think this is important for whoever the president is and for the American people to understand.
General Zinni also explained how it's not just about military strength, but nation building, and how that involves other abilities, including economics, politics, and diplomacy. He expressed that it is important to understand the unique capacities that are important to establishing other nations and assisting with failed states. Here's a point.
I would like to see us emphasize the non-military aspects early on, build partnerships internationally and regionally that work in vulnerable societies to help build these capacities early on. When it takes less commitment, it's easier to share the burden, it's easier to get international and regional cooperation to fix it before it becomes so terrible that it manifests itself in some horrible, unacceptable set of circumstances that we have to get involved in, and then involved in the worst way with military boots on the ground and violence. Now, there's certain things that we can do. We can obviously step back away from integration at the lowest levels where you're maybe most vulnerable, where we would maybe be partnering with them at higher levels where there's better vetting and trust, and not have individuals down at the lowest levels more exposed and more vulnerable. Also, we may help by training the trainers as opposed to doing the training ourselves. Easier to vet a small cadre of people that will be the trainers, impart the knowledge and what they need to do, and then let them go to do the training rather than be directly involved. But I think you're going to find from now till we come out, it's almost unavoidable that we're going to have this mix in order to ensure we're leaving a reasonably capable security force behind, so that danger is going to exist for a while. I know that General Mattis, the commander of CENTCOM, and General Allen, the commander in Afghanistan, have taken a number of these steps to try to minimize this, and it paid a great deal of attention to it. But it is a vulnerability. It's one the enemy senses, and it's one we need to take measures to prevent as we begin this exodus that will end at the end of 2014.
After describing some of the things that the military and the government could do as a whole, General Zinni left us with some words of wisdom for those who are interested in military or diplomacy work. He described how it's important to not only have a wide range of skills, but to have a knowledge in order to apply these things. The way it works today, according to him, is that you need to have a clear understanding of economics and culture and politics and how these things are fused together and how they impact people collectively and how this can allow a society to thrive. And he wants the next generation of leaders to listen to this point.
My best advice to anyone, really, not just military officers, and I find this in business, I find this in almost every field, that the most broadly educated individuals, the most broadly experienced individuals succeed better at the top. So it becomes critically important to open your sort of spectrum of interests and study and knowledge and travel to understand all this. You can't, for example, become the commander of U.S. Central Command and not understand these other aspects in the region. Just think of it in terms of purely a military job based on military to military relationships. And you had better understand the history, you had better understand the geography, you better understand the economic conditions in the region, the political conditions, the ethnic and religious set of circumstances you face. So that's my best piece of advice. Become a Renaissance man or woman.
General Zinni's outlook seems to fuse the idea of cultural understanding with military action and intelligence. General Zinni believes that if we want to build strong nations in areas that need our help, we must first appreciate their principles and capacities. Through his experience around the world and in the military and even in academia, General Zinni has answered his calling by sharing with us his insights on the importance of culture and smart diplomatic decision making. I'm Britt Johnson, and thanks so much for tuning in to Points of View.